I stood at the edge of the pier, watching the crew load equipment onto what had to be the most expensive submarine I'd ever seen outside of a military base. The Abyssal Clipper looked like something NASA would build if they decided to explore the ocean instead of space. All sleek curves and reinforced titanium plating that caught the harbor lights. 3 weeks had passed since that encrypted email landed in my inbox. The sender's address was a string of random characters I couldn't trace, but the offer was real enough. $50,000 for a 2-week deep-sea research expedition, plus expenses. The kind of money that would wipe out my student loans and buy me 6 months to find actual work. My advisor at the university had called it career suicide when I told him I was taking the job. "Sarah, you don't accept mysterious offers from anonymous sources. That's how people disappear." Dr. Peterson had a point, but he wasn't the one watching his research funding evaporate while student loan payments kept rolling in every month. The email had been brief. GPS coordinates for San Diego Harbor, a departure time, instructions to bring personal diving gear and expect 2 weeks at sea. Nothing about the actual research objectives or what samples we'd be collecting. Just that cryptic signature line. Deep waters hold deep secrets. I should have deleted it. Instead, I'd spent 3 days researching the coordinates and discovered they pointed to a section of the Pacific I'd never heard any legitimate research teams mention. Too far from standard shipping lanes, too deep for most commercial operations. The kind of place that made oceanographers nervous. A man approached from the ship's gangway, his boots heavy on the dock. Weathered skin, gray beard, and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of staring into ocean spray. He moved with the careful balance of someone who'd spent more time on deck than on land. "You're Campbell?" It wasn't a question. "That's me, Sarah Campbell, marine biology." I extended my hand, trying to project more confidence than I felt. He shook it once, firm grip, then let go. "Captain Matthew Torres, you're the last one to arrive." Matthew turned and walked back toward the ship without waiting for my response. I grabbed my duffel bag and followed him up the gangway, my boots clanging on the metal grating. The deck was spotless, every rope coiled with military precision, every surface polished to a dull shine that wouldn't reflect dangerous light at depth. "Impressive setup," I said, running my hand along the railing. The metal felt cold and substantial under my fingers. "It better be. We're going places most ships can't handle." Matthew stopped at what looked like the bridge entrance. "Your quarters are below deck. 3rd door on the left. Galleys at the end of the corridor. We'll do introductions once we're underway." He started to walk away, then paused. "Campbell, whatever you think you signed up for, forget it. This isn't a university research cruise." I wanted to ask what he meant, but Matthew had already disappeared into the bridge. The sound of engines rumbling to life beneath my feet suggested we'd be moving soon, whether I understood the situation or not. Below deck, the ship felt more like a high-tech laboratory than a traditional vessel. LED strips provided clean white lighting along corridors lined with equipment I didn't recognize. The air tasted recycled, carrying the faint chemical scent of advanced life support systems. My quarters turned out to be a compact but well-designed cabin with a narrow bunk, a desk built into the wall, and storage compartments that locked with electronic keypads. Someone had left a ship's manifest on the desk. 8 crew members total, including myself. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but I recognized Cheryl Anderson from her published work on marine microorganisms. I stowed my gear in the storage compartments and made my way to the galley. A woman with short brown hair was making coffee, her movements efficient and practiced. She looked up when I entered. "You must be the new biologist. I'm Cheryl Anderson." "Sarah Campbell. I know your work on deep-sea bacteria. Brilliant stuff." Cheryl poured a second cup without asking, and handed it to me. Thanks, though I have to admit, I'm not sure why they needed 2 marine biologists for this trip. 2? The manifest only shows my specialty. Check again. They've got me listed as microbiologist, but my background covers general marine biology too. Cheryl leaned against the counter, studying my face. How much did they tell you about this mission? Almost nothing. You? Same. Got the email 3 weeks ago, coordinates, departure time, payment details. Nothing about objectives or methodology. She took a sip of coffee. My department head thinks I'm insane. Mine too. The ship lurched slightly as we pulled away from the dock. Through the small porthole, I could see the harbor lights starting to move past us. No turning back now. Did you meet the rest of the crew? I asked. Some of them. Engineers mostly. A couple of guys whose job descriptions I can't figure out. Everyone seems to be on a need-to-know basis. Cheryl set down her cup. The captain doesn't exactly encourage social interaction. I noticed. Very chatty guy. Right? I tried asking him about the research protocols this morning. He told me I'd find out when we reached depth. She paused. Whatever that means. The engines changed pitch, and I felt the ship adjust course. We were heading out to open water now, leaving the protected harbor behind. The gentle rocking motion would become more pronounced once we hit the ocean swells. The equipment on this ship is incredible, I said. Some of those instruments in the corridors look like they belong in a government facility. I was thinking the same thing. The pressure suits alone probably cost more than my annual salary. Cheryl refilled her coffee cup. Makes you wonder who's really funding this expedition. Before I could respond, a voice came over the ship's intercom system. Matthew's voice, clear and authoritative. All crew to the main deck. Briefing in 5 minutes. Cheryl and I exchanged looks. Finally, some answers. The main deck had been transformed into a meeting area with folding chairs arranged in a rough circle. 7 other people were already seated when we arrived. 6 men and 1 additional woman I hadn't met yet. The engineers looked like they'd worked on ships before, weathered hands and practical clothing. The others were harder to read. Matthew stood in the center of the circle, holding a manila envelope in each hand. He'd changed into a dark blue uniform that made him look more official, more military. We're now 2 hours out of San Diego, heading for coordinates I've programmed into the navigation system. Our destination is approximately 1,200 miles southwest in international waters. He handed an envelope to each crew member. These contain your specific duties for this mission. Do not open them until I give the order. I turned the envelope over in my hands. My name was typed on a plain white label, nothing else. The envelope was sealed with what looked like security tape. "What's our research objective?" asked one of the engineers, a man with graying temples and calloused hands. "Deep sea sample collection, geological and biological specimens from target depth." Matthew's response sounded rehearsed. "Each of your envelopes contains detailed protocols for your area of responsibility." Target depth? Cheryl leaned forward in her chair. "How deep are we talking?" Matthew looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Deeper than any of you have been before." "That's not really an answer," I said. "It's the only answer you're getting right now." Matthew's tone suggested the discussion was over. "We'll reach the coordinates in approximately 18 hours. Get some rest, familiarize yourselves with the ship's layout, and prepare your equipment. Questions about specific protocols can wait until you've read your assignments." He started to walk away, then stopped. "One more thing. This is a closed mission. No communications with outside parties until we return to port. The radio equipment is for emergency use only. What about check-ins with our institutions? Asked the woman I hadn't met. Already handled. Your supervisors have been informed you'll be out of contact for the duration of the expedition. Matthew stepped toward the bridge entrance. Dinner's at 1900 hours. We'll do another briefing tomorrow morning. The meeting disbanded quickly, crew members dispersing to different parts of the ship with their sealed envelopes. I caught Cheryl's eye and jerked my head toward the stern. She nodded and followed me to a quiet corner of the deck. The harbor was far behind us now, just a faint glow on the horizon. We were surrounded by dark water that stretched to every edge of the visible world. The ship's engines maintained a steady rhythm, carrying us toward coordinates I couldn't find on any standard oceanographic chart. This whole setup feels wrong, Cheryl said quietly. Professional research expeditions don't work like this. I know, but the money's real, and the equipment is definitely real. I hefted the sealed envelope. Maybe once we read these, things will make more sense. Maybe. Cheryl looked out at the dark water. Or maybe we just made the biggest mistake of our careers. I didn't have an answer for that. The ship continued its steady course toward unknown coordinates, carrying 8 strangers who'd all received the same mysterious offer. Whatever waited for us in the deep water, we'd find out together. The engines hummed beneath our feet, pushing us farther from shore with each passing minute. I pressed my face closer to the monitor screen, watching the depth gauge tick steadily downward as we began our descent into the deep ocean trench. 18 hours had passed since we'd left the harbor lights behind, and Matthew had finally given the order to begin the dive sequence after we reached the target coordinates. The sealed envelope sat unopened on the desk beside me. His instructions had been clear about waiting until he gave the order, which he'd said would come once we reached depth. Around me, the ship hummed with the controlled energy of a precision machine. Banks of monitors displayed readouts from dozens of sensors, tracking everything from hull pressure to water temperature as we dropped through the ocean layers. This was the part I'd always loved about deep-sea research, the methodical descent through zones most humans would never see, each depth revealing new mysteries about our planet's hidden geography. The external cameras showed the familiar blue-green glow of the upper ocean, sunlight still penetrating enough to create that ethereal underwater cathedral effect. But as we passed the 3,000-foot mark and entered what marine biologists called the twilight zone, something felt wrong. The water looked empty. I'd made dozens of descents through this depth range during my graduate work, and the twilight zone was usually alive with bioluminescent creatures. Jellyfish pulsing with electric blue patterns, lanternfish creating galaxies of living stars, siphonophores trailing strings of lights like underwater Christmas decorations. The cameras should have been recording a light show that rivaled anything humans had created. Instead, the water around us remained dark and lifeless, as if we were dropping through liquid obsidian. "Cheryl," I called across the equipment bay where she was setting up her sampling station. "Are you seeing this on your monitors?" She looked up from calibrating her microscope, her expression puzzled. "Seeing what?" "The complete absence of life. We should be surrounded by bioluminescence at this depth." Cheryl moved to the bank of external cameras, cycling through different viewing angles. Her frown deepened as she scanned the feeds. "That's unusual. Even in low productivity areas, you'd expect some vertical migration activity." The sonar operator, James, turned in his chair. "We're getting some weird readings on the sonar array. Contacts that show up for a few seconds, then disappear completely." I moved to a station, studying the sonar display. Blips of various sizes appeared on the screen like ghosts. Some large enough to be whales, others small and darting. But when the sonar swept back across the same area moments later, nothing was there. Equipment malfunction, I asked. Ran full diagnostics before we started descent. Everything checks out. James adjusted the sonar range, but the phantom contacts continued appearing and vanishing. It's like there's something out there that doesn't want to be tracked. The ship's intercom crackled to life. Matthew's voice carried that same authoritative tone from the earlier briefing. All stations report status. We're approaching 5,000 feet. One by one, the crew members checked in. Engineering reported normal operations. Navigation confirmed we were on course for the target coordinates. The hull integrity sensors showed all green across the board. Everything was functioning exactly as designed, which somehow made the empty water around us feel more ominous. Cheryl returned to her sampling station and deployed the first collection probe. The robotic arm extended from the ship's hull, its camera providing a close-up view as it drew water into a sterile container. The sample looked perfectly normal, clear, deep ocean water with the expected microscopic particles suspended in the current. She transferred the sample to her analysis chamber and bent over the microscope. I watched her face as she focused the lens, expecting to see the familiar concentration that came with examining new specimens. Instead, her expression shifted to confusion, then concern. "Sarah, come look at this." I joined her at the microscope station. "What are you seeing?" "Look at the sample." I peered into the eyepiece, adjusting the focus. The sample that had appeared clear just minutes ago was now completely black, as if someone had mixed ink into the container. But the transformation wasn't uniform. Tendrils of darkness swirled through the water like smoke, moving in patterns that seemed almost organic. "Equipment contamination," I suggested, though I'd watched her follow standard sterilization protocols. "That's what I thought." Cheryl moved to a second microscope where she'd prepared a control sample using distilled water from the ship's laboratory stores. "But look at this." The control sample was crystal clear, exactly as it should be. Whatever was happening to the ocean water wasn't affecting the ship's internal systems. "Try another collection," I said. Cheryl deployed the sampling arm again, this time drawing water from a depth of 6,000 feet. We watched the robotic probe extend and retract, the collection chamber sealing with a soft click that transmitted through the hull. The new sample looked identical to the first, clear, normal deep ocean water. But within 3 minutes of exposure to the ship's laboratory environment, the same transformation began. Black tendrils appeared like veins through the sample, spreading and coalescing until the entire container looked like it held liquid coal. "This doesn't make sense," Cheryl muttered, running additional diagnostics on her equipment. "The chemical composition shows normal saline content, expected mineral concentrations, typical deep water characteristics. But optically, it's changing into something else entirely." The intercom crackled again. "Passing 10,000 feet. Engineering report on electrical systems." "Minor fluctuations in the auxiliary power grid," came Robert's response from below deck. "Nothing outside normal parameters, but we're seeing some unusual variations in the magnetic field readings." I looked at the depth gauge. 10,000 feet put us well into the bathypelagic zone, the realm of eternal darkness where the pressure would crush an unprotected human body in milliseconds. The external cameras now showed nothing but black water lit by the ship's powerful LED arrays. "James, are you still getting those phantom sonar contacts?" I asked. He nodded grimly. "More of them now, bigger ones too. Some of these readings suggest objects the size of blue whales, but they're moving in ways that don't match any known marine life." "What kind of movements?" "Perfect geometric patterns. Straight lines, 90-degree turns, formations that look almost coordinated." The temperature in the equipment bay seemed to drop a few degrees, though the climate control systems maintained their steady hum. I checked the external temperature sensors and felt my stomach tighten. The readings were fluctuating wildly, one moment showing the expected near-freezing temperatures of deep water, the next spiking to levels that should have been impossible at this depth. "Cheryl, are you seeing these temperature anomalies?" She glanced at her instruments, then did a double take. "That can't be right. The sensors are showing thermal spikes of 40 degrees Celsius. At this depth, that would require massive geothermal activity. Or equipment failure. Multiple independent sensors can't all fail in the same way." She pulled up additional readings on her screen. The pressure sensors are fluctuating too, but not in correlation with the temperature changes. It's like the water around us is unstable. The ship continued its descent, passing 15,000 feet, then 20,000. The crew's chatter over the intercom became more subdued, punctuated by reports of minor electrical anomalies that were becoming less minor with each passing hour. Lights flickered in the corridors. Computer systems required more frequent reboots. The engineers' voices carried an edge of concern. They were trying to keep professional. "Captain," Robert called over the comm. "We're showing power fluctuations in the main electrical grid. Might want to slow the descent until we can diagnose the issue." Matthew's response was immediate and firm. "Descent continues as scheduled. Run diagnostics on secondary systems." I exchanged a look with Cheryl. Standard deep-sea protocol called for investigating any electrical anomalies before proceeding to greater depth. The pressure at 25,000 feet could turn minor problems into catastrophic failures. "Captain Torres," I spoke into the intercom. "This is Campbell. We're seeing significant equipment malfunctions in the laboratory systems. Request permission to halt descent and investigate." The intercom stayed silent for several seconds. When Matthew's voice returned, it carried a tone that discouraged further discussion. "All stations maintain current operations. We're behind schedule." Behind schedule for what? The mission parameters in our sealed envelopes remained unopened, our actual objectives still a mystery. But something in Matthew's voice suggested he was operating under pressures none of us understood. At 25,000 feet, the ship's external lights began to flicker. The LED arrays that illuminated the water around us dimmed and brightened in irregular patterns, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of our motion through the water. I watched the external cameras, trying to understand what I was seeing. The shadows weren't behaving like shadows should. They twisted and coiled through the water like living things, stretching away from our lights in directions that defied the laws of physics. "James, are your sonar contacts correlating with these shadow movements?" He studied his displays, face pale in the green glow of the instruments. "The contacts are everywhere now, surrounding us, but they're not reflecting sonar properly. The returns are all wrong, like the sound waves are being absorbed instead of bounced back." The water temperature readings continued their impossible fluctuations. Thermal spikes that should have boiled the water at the surface appeared and vanished on our sensors, like phantom heat sources. The pressure readings showed variations that would have indicated massive structural changes in the ocean floor, but our mapping systems detected no corresponding topographical features. "Sarah." Cheryl's voice was tight with concern. "Look at this sample." I turned to find her staring at one of the collection containers. The black substance that had formed in the water sample was moving. Not the random, swirling motion of liquid mixing, but purposeful movement, as if something inside the container was alive and testing the boundaries of its containment. "That's not possible." "I know." Cheryl's hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microscope settings. "But it's responding to stimuli. When I tap the container, it moves toward the sound. When I shine a light on it, it recoils, The black substance pressed against the walls of the collection chamber like a living thing trying to escape. Tendrils formed and reformed, probing the container's seal with what looked disturbingly like intelligence. 30,000 feet, Matthew announced over the intercom. All stations prepare for final descent phase. As if his words had triggered some response from the ocean itself, every system on the ship began screaming warnings simultaneously. Hull pressure alarms, electrical fault indicators, temperature alerts, the coordinated failure of multiple independent systems that should have been impossible. Then, without warning, the radio crackled with static and went dead. Our communication link with the surface had been cut, leaving us completely isolated in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the steadily increasing tempo of system failure alarms throughout the ship. We were alone at 30,000 feet, surrounded by water that defied everything we understood about deep-sea physics. Our equipment failing in ways that made no scientific sense, and something dark and intelligent moving in the samples we'd collected from the abyss. I gripped the edge of the console as another wave of system failures cascaded through the ship's displays. 30 minutes had passed since our radio went silent, and the Abyssal Clipper was dying around us piece by piece. The navigation computers were the first to surrender completely. One moment, Matthew was tracking our descent coordinates. The next, he was staring at blank screens that refused to respond to any input. He pressed keys with increasing urgency, his weathered fingers dancing across interfaces that had become decorative panels. "Manual navigation only," he announced through gritted teeth, though his voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. The confidence that had defined every interaction since we'd left harbor was fracturing. The pressure sensors died next, their steady digital readouts replaced by error messages that flashed red against the darkened displays. Our depth gauges followed within minutes, leaving us completely blind to our position in the water column. We could be at 35,000 feet, or 50,000 feet. The crushing weight of the ocean above us had become an unknown quantity. Cheryl abandoned her microscope station and moved to the backup navigation panel, trying to coax information from systems that were shutting down faster than we could diagnose the problems. Her face was pale in the flickering light of the few remaining functional displays. "Hull integrity sensors are offline," she reported. "Sonar array is down. We're flying blind." The backup generators kicked in with a mechanical whine that reverberated through the ship's frame. Emergency lighting bathed everything in an ominous red glow that made our shadows stretch and dance on the walls like phantoms. The familiar white LED strips that had made the ship feel clean and scientific were gone, replaced by the hellish illumination of a vessel in crisis. That's when the hull started making sounds I'd never heard from a deep-sea vessel before. Low groans echoed through the corridors, metal speaking under stress, in a language that didn't match anything from my training. Deep-sea ships were designed to handle enormous pressure differentials, their hulls engineered to compress and flex within acceptable parameters. But these sounds were different. Irregular creaks and sighs that seemed to come from random sections of the ship. James worked frantically at his engineering station, pulling up structural diagrams that flickered in and out of existence as more systems failed. "These readings don't make sense," he muttered. "The hull stress patterns are all wrong for our depth." "What do you mean wrong?" I asked, moving to look over his shoulder. "The pressure distribution is uneven. It's like something outside is pushing against specific sections of the hull, not the uniform pressure we should be getting from water depth." Robert's voice crackled over the dying intercom system from the lower decks. "Captain, we've got electrical faults in the main power grid. The generators are cycling on and off independently. I can't maintain stable power to critical systems." Matthew's response was clipped and professional, but I could hear the strain underneath. "Do what you can. We need life support and ballast control operational." The ship groaned again, a deep metallic sigh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The emergency lighting flickered, casting us into momentary darkness before the red glow returned. In those brief seconds of absolute black, the silence was complete except for the sound of our own breathing and the distant hum of struggling machinery. "How deep are we?" Cheryl asked, though she already knew no one could answer. "Depth charges suggest we passed 35,000 feet before the sensors failed," Matthew replied. But that was 20 minutes ago. As if his words had triggered some final catastrophe, every remaining system on the ship died simultaneously. The emergency lighting vanished. The gentle hum of air circulation stopped. The electronic displays that had been flickering went completely dark. Even the backup power indicators that should have remained active in any conceivable failure scenario were extinguished. We were plunged into absolute darkness and silence, so complete it felt like being buried alive. I reached out instinctively, my hands finding the edge of the console I'd been standing beside. The metal was still warm from the electronics that had been running moments before, but now it felt like touching the corpse of some enormous machine. Around me, I could hear the others moving carefully, their breathing sharp and controlled. "Anyone have a flashlight?" Cheryl's voice came from somewhere to my left. "Emergency lighting should have kicked in," James said. "Even if everything else fails, the battery-powered system should still be running." But nothing happened. We floated in the crushing depths of the ocean, entombed in a vessel that had become completely unresponsive to human control. The only sounds were our voices and the occasional settling noise from the ship's frame as it adjusted to forces we couldn't measure or understand. Minutes passed, then hours. The emergency air supply activated automatically. We could hear the hiss of oxygen mixing systems engaging somewhere in the walls, though no lights accompanied the life support functions. The air tasted metallic and recycled, carrying the bitter flavor of emergency reserves being deployed. In the darkness, time became elastic. Without visual references or working chronometers, I found myself counting my own breathing to track the passage of minutes. The others shifted restlessly in their positions, the soft sounds of movement the only indication that I wasn't alone in the black void. Someone was hyperventilating. The rapid, shallow breathing cut through the silence like a saw blade. Panic made audible. I thought it might be one of the engineers, but in the absolute darkness, voices became disembodied and difficult to place. "Slow your breathing," Matthew's voice commanded from the darkness. "Emergency air is limited. Stay calm." But calm was a relative concept when you were trapped in a powerless submarine at depths that could crush human bones like eggshells. The ship creaked and groaned around us, metal expanding and contracting under pressures that our failed instruments couldn't measure. Each sound made me wonder if the hull was finally reaching its breaking point. I tried to focus on practical concerns. How long could we survive on emergency air? Did the ballast systems have manual overrides that would function without power? Was there any way to signal for rescue from this depth? But every logical analysis led to the same conclusion. Without power, we were helpless. The hyperventilating got worse. I heard someone moving in the darkness, probably trying to help whoever was panicking, but the sounds of distress continued. The enclosed space amplified every breath and whisper, creating an acoustic prison that made the psychological pressure almost unbearable. 4 hours passed, maybe 5. I had given up trying to count my breathing and was instead listening to the ship's hull, learning the rhythm of its complaints as it flexed under the enormous weight of water above us. Each groan and creak became familiar, a mechanical heartbeat that proved we were still alive inside our metal shell. Then, without any warning or preliminary flickering, every system on the ship came back online simultaneously. The sudden flood of white light was like being struck by lightning. Emergency displays blazed to life, casting harsh illumination through the compartments that had been pitch black seconds before. I threw my hands up to shield my eyes, the brightness painful after hours of absolute darkness. Around me, the others were doing the same, squinting and cursing as their vision adjusted to the sudden return of the ship's normal lighting. The familiar hum of electronics and air circulation systems filled the space, replacing the oppressive silence with the comforting sounds of a functioning vessel. "What the hell?" Cheryl mumbled, blinking rapidly as she tried to focus on her instrument displays. I lowered my hands gradually, letting my eyes adjust to the restored lighting. The ship looked exactly as it had before the power failure. Clean corridors, functioning displays, all systems apparently normal. It was as if the last 6 hours had been some kind of shared hallucination. Matthew was already at the navigation console, checking our status displays with the focused intensity of a man who had spent too many hours in helpless darkness. "All systems show green across the board," he announced. "Power levels normal, life support operational, hull integrity intact." "How is that possible?" James asked from his engineering station. "The main generators were completely offline. You can't restart systems that suffered that kind of total failure without extensive manual intervention." "I don't know," Matthew replied, but his attention was already shifting to the external camera controls. "Let's see where we ended up." He activated the external viewing systems, and the main display screen filled with the feed from our hull-mounted cameras. What we saw made every conversation stop immediately. We had reached the bottom. The ocean floor stretched out in every direction, visible in the bright cone of our external lighting systems. But this wasn't the rocky terrain or sediment-covered plain that oceanographic surveys had led us to expect at these depths. The entire visible area was covered in thick black sludge that undulated slowly across the seafloor like a living thing. It moved in waves that had nothing to do with ocean currents, rising and falling in patterns that looked disturbingly organic. The substance appeared to be breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that suggested something vast and alive sleeping beneath our ship. As our cameras panned across the scene, the black sludge responded to our lights, rippling away from the illumination in some areas while seeming to reach toward the ship in others. Tendrils of the dark material stretched upward from the ocean floor, testing the water around our hull like fingers, exploring the surface of an unfamiliar object. We had found the source of whatever had been affecting our samples and instruments during the descent, and it knew we were here. I watched Cheryl move to the sample collection controls with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout our descent. But her hands trembled slightly as she activated the robotic arm. The external cameras tracked the mechanical appendage as it extended from the ship's hull, its collection chamber gleaming under our powerful LED arrays. The black sludge responded to the intrusion immediately. What had appeared to be a relatively static substance covering the ocean floor began writhing and coiling around the robotic arm like something alive and defensive. Thick tendrils wrapped around the collection probe, and for a moment, I thought the sludge might prevent us from taking any sample at all. But Cheryl persisted, maneuvering the arm deeper into the undulating mass until the collection chamber sealed with its familiar mechanical click. The sludge released its grip reluctantly, seeming to flow away from the retreating probe with what looked disturbingly like resentment. "Got it," Cheryl announced, though her voice carried none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied successful sample collection. She transferred the sealed chamber to her analysis station and prepared a microscope slide with practiced efficiency. I remained at the external monitoring station, keeping one eye on our cameras while watching her work. The sludge outside continued its slow, rhythmic movement across the seafloor, but I noticed it was gradually shifting position relative to our ship. What had initially appeared random now seemed to be following some kind of pattern, as if the substance was repositioning itself around us. Cheryl bent over her microscope, adjusting the focus with quick, nervous movements. I'd seen her examine thousands of samples during our brief time aboard the ship, and she always approached new specimens with calm, scientific curiosity. This time was different. Her shoulders tensed as she peered into the eyepiece, and she made a sharp intake of breath that cut through the low hum of the ship's systems. "What are you seeing?" I asked, moving closer to her station. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the magnification settings and refocused the lens several times, as if trying to convince herself that what she was observing couldn't be real. Her face grew progressively paler, and her hands began shaking more noticeably as she worked the microscope controls. "Cheryl, what is it?" She finally looked up from the eyepiece, her expression a mixture of scientific fascination and absolute horror. "It's not just alive," she whispered. "It's organized, structured. There are patterns inside it that look almost like..." Before she could finish the sentence, she stumbled backward from the microscope as if she'd been physically struck. Her chair rolled away from the station and she pointed at the sample container with a trembling finger. The black sludge in the collection chamber was moving, not the random swirling motion we'd observed in the earlier water samples, but deliberate, purposeful movement. The substance pressed against the walls of the glass container, forming tendrils that explored the surface like fingers testing for weakness. It flowed upward along the sides of the chamber, defying gravity in ways that violated basic physics, then pooled at the top before dropping back down to repeat the process. "That's impossible," I said, though I was watching it happen with my own eyes. The sludge continued its exploration of the container, forming increasingly complex shapes as it moved. Spiral patterns that reminded me of DNA helixes, geometric formations that looked like crystalline structures, brief moments where the substance seemed to organize itself into something that resembled neural networks, complete with branching pathways that pulsed with darker veins of material. Then, as if responding to our observation, the entire mass of sludge outside the ship began to move. The external cameras showed waves of black substance rising from the ocean floor in massive, coordinated surges. These weren't the random undulations we'd observed when we first reached the bottom. The sludge was lifting itself in enormous sheets that stretched beyond the range of our lights, creating walls of dark material that towered above our ship like liquid mountains. The first wave struck the Abyssal Clipper's hull with tremendous force, sending shockwaves through the ship's frame that knocked both Cheryl and me off balance. The impact wasn't the gentle contact of deep-sea currents against a stationary object. It felt deliberate, as if something massive had deliberately struck our vessel to test its structural integrity. "Captain!" I called into the intercom. "We're taking impacts from the external mass. Recommend immediate ascent." Matthew's voice crackled back through the speakers, but the transmission was distorted by increasing electrical interference. "Trying to activate ballast tanks. Controls are not responding properly." Another wave of sludge crashed against the ship, this time from a different angle. The hull groaned under the impact, and several of our external lights flickered and went dark. Through the remaining cameras, I could see that we were being completely surrounded. The black substance had risen from the sea floor to form a writhing dome around the Abyssal Clipper, cutting off our view of the open ocean beyond. "Emergency ascent protocols," Matthew announced over the intercom, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "All hands prepare for rapid decompression sequence." But when he tried to activate the ballast release system, nothing happened. The controls that should have emptied our ballast tanks and sent us rocketing toward the surface remained completely unresponsive. Every button press, every switch activation produced no result, as if the ship's fundamental systems had been severed from their mechanical connections. The electrical interference was getting worse. Monitor displays flickered with static, and the ship's internal lighting dimmed and brightened in irregular patterns, that reminded me uncomfortably of the sludge's own rhythmic movements outside our hull. That's when I noticed the first signs of infiltration. A thin line of black substance was seeping through a ventilation grate near the ceiling of the equipment bay. The vent should have been sealed against water intrusion at these depths, protected by multiple redundant barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of breach. But the sludge was finding its way inside anyway, flowing through gaps that shouldn't have existed in a properly functioning deep-sea vessel. "Cheryl, look at the ceiling." She followed my gaze and went rigid when she saw the black material beginning to drip from the ventilation system. The droplets didn't fall like normal liquid. They moved with purpose, flowing upward along the walls and spreading in patterns that suggested they were actively exploring the ship's interior layout. More infiltration points appeared throughout the compartment. The sludge squeezed through seals around door frames, emerged from electrical conduits, and began seeping up through what appeared to be microscopic gaps in the deck plating. Within minutes, thin streams of the black substance were entering the ship from dozens of different locations simultaneously. Robert's voice crackled over the failing intercom system from the engineering decks below. "Captain, we've got some kind of contamination down here. Black substance coming through the bulkheads. It's eating through the metal like acid." "Can you contain it?" Matthew's response was nearly drowned out by static. "Negative. It's spreading too fast. We're seeing structural damage to primary systems. James is trying to..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by silence that was somehow more alarming than any emergency report. I grabbed the internal communications handset and tried to re-establish contact with the lower decks. "Robert, respond. James, please respond." Nothing but static answered my calls. The sludge inside our compartment was spreading faster now, the individual streams connecting and forming larger pools that moved across the floor with predatory fluidity. It wasn't simply flowing downhill or following the ship's orientation. The substance was actively hunting, sending exploratory tendrils toward our feet, while the main mass positioned itself between us and the exit. "We need to get out of here," Cheryl said, backing toward the corridor that led to the upper decks. But when she reached the doorway, she stopped and let out a small, horrified gasp. The hallway beyond was already ankle-deep in the flowing black substance, and more was pouring in from every opening. The ship's entire lower section had been compromised. From somewhere below us came a sound that made my blood freeze. A scream, cut short so abruptly that it was clear whatever had caused it had been instantaneous and final. Then another scream, this one lasting longer, but ending with the same terrifying suddenness. James and Robert were gone. I looked at the sludge advancing across our floor and realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't just some unknown deep-sea organism we'd accidentally disturbed. The black substance was hunting us with intelligence and purpose, using the ship's own systems against us as it dissolved everything it touched. It had isolated us, cut off our escape routes, and was now closing in with the patience of something that had been doing this for far longer than human civilization had existed. The Abyssal Clipper was no longer our vessel of exploration. It had become our tomb, and something ancient and malevolent was ensuring that none of us would leave the bottom of the ocean alive. I turned from the doorway where Cheryl stood, frozen, looking at the ankle-deep sludge filling the corridor beyond our compartment. The black substance was moving faster now, flowing into our equipment bay from multiple entry points like some coordinated assault. We had seconds before it would cut off any possibility of escape. "The safe room," I said, grabbing Cheryl's arm and pulling her away from the compromised exit. "There's an emergency chamber on the upper deck." We ran toward the maintenance ladder that led to the ship's higher levels, the sludge pursuing us with liquid tendrils that stretched across the floor, like grasping fingers. I could hear it behind us, a wet sliding sound that grew louder as more of the substance poured through the ship's failing barriers. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation, but we climbed with desperate speed, emerging onto the upper deck where the ship's emergency systems were housed. The safe room was built into the superstructure, a reinforced chamber designed to protect crew members during catastrophic hull breaches or fire emergencies. I'd seen it during our initial tour, but never imagined I'd need to use it. Behind us, black sludge began flowing up through the deck access hatch we'd just climbed. The substance defied gravity, moving upward along the walls and ceiling like something that had never learned the rules that governed normal matter. It spread in branching patterns that reminded me of blood vessels or neural networks, each tendril probing and testing the ship's structure as it advanced. The safe room door was a massive steel barrier with manual locks that required physical strength to operate. I threw my weight against the first wheel lock while Cheryl worked the second, both of us straining against mechanisms that hadn't been designed for quick operation. The locks finally gave way with metallic grinding sounds that echoed through the corridor. More crew voices were echoing from other parts of the ship now, panicked shouts and calls for help that cut through the mechanical groaning of the vessel's stressed hull. I recognized Tom's voice from engineering, then Lisa from navigation, both calling out in terror before their voices were abruptly silenced. The black sludge was hunting throughout the ship simultaneously, finding every person who remained alive and eliminating them with efficient brutality. We pushed through the safe room entrance just as the first tendrils of sludge reached the corridor where we stood. I slammed the heavy door behind us, spinning the internal wheel locks with frantic energy, while Cheryl activated the chamber's emergency sealing system. Pressurized air hissed through the walls as the room isolated itself from the ship's compromised atmosphere. The safe room was smaller than I'd expected, barely large enough for 4 people to stand comfortably. Emergency supplies lined the walls: sealed water containers, oxygen tanks, basic medical equipment, and communication gear. A small circular porthole provided the only view outside the chamber, its thick glass designed to withstand enormous pressure differentials. Through that porthole, I could see into the ship's main corridor, where Matthew was fighting his way through the spreading sludge. The captain moved with desperate determination, pushing against the black substance that now reached his waist as he struggled toward the manual ballast controls. The sludge clung to his legs like thick mud, but he forced each step forward with sheer willpower. Cheryl pressed her face against the porthole beside me, watching Matthew's progress with horrified fascination. "He's trying to reach the emergency systems," she whispered. The manual ballast release was located in a recessed panel near the ship's central communication station. Matthew had to wade through increasingly deep sludge to reach it, the black substance rising around him as if it understood his intentions and was trying to prevent him from succeeding. "Come on," I found myself saying, though I knew he couldn't hear me through the sealed chamber walls. Cheryl left the porthole and moved toward the corridor that connected to the main hallway, apparently thinking she could help him somehow. But when she reached for the safe room's inner door controls, I caught her arm. "Don't open it. The sludge will get in here too." She pulled away from me with surprising strength. "We can't just watch him die." Before I could stop her, she had activated the door's manual override and was stepping back into the ship's main corridor. The sludge immediately began flowing toward the open safe room entrance, but Cheryl managed to reseal the chamber door from the outside, trapping herself in the corridor with the advancing black mass. Through the porthole, I watched her wade through the sludge toward Matthew, who had nearly reached the ballast controls. The substance was up to her knees, then her waist, moving with predatory intelligence as it recognized another victim within its reach. She pushed forward anyway, extending her hand toward Matthew as he strained to reach the emergency lever. The sludge surged upward around Cheryl's legs, spreading with terrifying speed as it began covering her body. She screamed, a sound that penetrated even the safe room's thick walls, and I pressed my hands against the porthole glass as if I could somehow reach through and pull her back. "Help me!" she screamed, looking directly at the porthole where I stood watching in helpless horror. The black substance was covering her chest now, flowing upward with the deliberate patience of something that knew its prey couldn't escape. Matthew turned at the sound of her voice and saw what was happening. Instead of continuing toward the ballast controls, he changed direction and fought his way through the deepening sludge toward Cheryl. But he was too late. The black mass engulfed her completely, her final scream cutting off abruptly as the sludge covered her face and head. Where Cheryl had been standing, only a vaguely human-shaped mound of writhing darkness remained, and even that dissolved into the larger mass within seconds. Matthew stared at the spot where she had disappeared, his face a mask of rage and determination. Then he turned back toward the ballast controls, moving with renewed urgency through sludge that was now nearly chest deep. Each step was a monumental effort, but he kept pushing forward until he reached the recessed panel. The manual ballast release was protected by a safety cover that required two-handed operation to prevent accidental activation. Matthew struggled with the mechanism, the black sludge rising around his shoulders as he worked. Finally, the cover swung open, revealing the bright red emergency lever beneath. He looked back toward the safe room porthole, his eyes finding mine through the thick glass. Even at that distance, I could see the knowledge in his expression, the understanding that pulling the lever would save the ship, but probably cost him his life. "Stay hidden until you reach the surface," he shouted, though his voice was muffled by the chamber walls. "Don't let them cover this up." Then he pulled the emergency ballast release lever with both hands, throwing his full weight against the mechanism until it clicked into position. The ship shuddered violently as the ballast tanks emptied, releasing thousands of gallons of water that had been keeping us stable at depth. The sudden buoyancy change sent vibrations through the entire vessel, and I felt the floor tilt as the Abyssal Clipper began its emergency ascent toward the surface. The sludge covering Matthew seemed to convulse at the ship's movement, flowing over his head and shoulders as he disappeared beneath the black mass. His final words echoed in my memory as I watched the substance where he had been standing gradually settle and spread across the corridor floor. The ascent was violent and uncontrolled. Without computer systems to regulate the rate of rise, the ship rocketed upward through the water column at dangerous speed. The hull groaned and creaked under the changing pressure, metal plates expanding and contracting as we moved from the crushing depths toward the surface far above. Through the porthole, I could see the sludge filling the ship's corridors, flowing like black water as the vessel's orientation shifted during ascent. But it wasn't behaving like normal liquid. The substance moved against the ship's motion, flowing upward along walls and pooling in areas that should have been impossible given our angle of ascent. It was testing the safe room's door seals. I could hear it outside the chamber, a wet, sliding sound as tendrils of sludge probed around the doorframe, searching for any gap or weakness that might allow entry. The seals held, but the constant testing never stopped. For hours, the black substance continued its patient exploration of every inch of the chamber's exterior, pressing against the barriers that separated it from its final victim. The temperature inside the safe room began dropping as we rose through the ocean's thermal layers. At depth, the water temperature had been just above freezing, but the chamber's insulation and my body heat had kept the interior comfortable. As we ascended, the changing pressure and the ship's damaged environmental systems allowed cold to seep through the walls. I wrapped myself in an emergency blanket from the supply cabinet and settled against the chamber's back wall, as far from the porthole as possible. I didn't want to see what was happening in the corridors outside, but I could still hear the sludge moving through the ship, a constant wet sound that suggested it was flowing through every compartment, consuming everything it touched. Hours passed. I rationed the emergency water supply, taking small sips from the sealed containers while trying to conserve my body heat. The safe room's air recycling system continued functioning, providing breathable atmosphere even as the rest of the ship's systems failed around us. The ascent seemed to take forever. Without working chronometers or depth gauges, I had no way to track our progress except by the gradually changing sounds of the hull under pressure. The metal groaning grew less pronounced as we rose, indicating decreasing water pressure, but we were still far from the surface. Exhaustion began taking its toll. I found myself drifting in and out of sleep, always jerking awake at some new sound from outside the chamber. Sometimes it was the hull settling as pressure changed. Other times it was the sludge testing the door seals with renewed intensity, as if it sensed I was becoming weaker and more vulnerable. 18 hours after Matthew had pulled the emergency ballast release, I felt the ship's motion change from the smooth vertical ascent to the rolling movement of surface waves. The Abyssal Clipper had broken through to the surface world, carrying me and its cargo of black death back to the realm of sunlight and breathable air. But I remained locked in the safe room, listening to the sludge moving through the ship's corridors, knowing that opening the chamber door would mean immediate death. I had survived the ascent, but I was still trapped with something that had already killed everyone else aboard, and I had no idea how long I could remain hidden before it found a way inside. I counted my breaths in the darkness of the safe room, using the rhythm to track the hours as they crawled by. The ship's motion had changed sometime during what I estimated was the 23rd hour of my confinement, the smooth vertical movement of ascent, replaced by the familiar rolling of surface waves. We had broken through to the world above. The rolling motion brought a mix of relief and terror. Relief because we had escaped the crushing depths where that black mass had consumed my colleagues. Terror because I was still trapped in a vessel that had been thoroughly infiltrated by something that defied every law of physics I understood. I pressed my ear against the safe room door, listening for any sound of movement in the corridors beyond. The wet, sliding noise that had plagued me throughout the ascent had stopped completely. No more testing of the door seals. No more liquid exploration of the ship's interior. The silence felt almost as unnatural as the sounds had been. Still, I waited. 2 more hours passed before I worked up the courage to unlock the chamber door. My hands shook as I turned the manual wheel locks, the metallic grinding echoing in the small space. The seals released with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. The corridor beyond was empty. Not just empty of the black sludge, but empty of everything. Where thick streams of dark substance had flowed along the walls and pooled on the floor, only stains remained. Black marks covered every surface like burn patterns, but the sludge itself had vanished completely. The ship looked like it had been scoured by fire, leaving behind only the charred evidence of what had happened. I moved through the corridors carefully, checking each compartment for any sign of my dead colleagues or the substance that had killed them. The equipment bay where Cheryl and I had worked was gutted, all the scientific instruments destroyed or melted into unrecognizable shapes. Black stains covered the walls in branching patterns that reminded me of lightning strikes or blood vessels. The lower decks were worse. Entire sections of bulkhead had been eaten away, leaving gaps in the ship's structure that should have allowed water to flood the compartments. But the ship remained afloat, somehow maintaining buoyancy despite damage that should have sent us straight back to the ocean floor. I found no trace of Matthew, Cheryl, James, Robert, or any of the other crew members. Not bodies, not clothing, not even the equipment they had been carrying. The sludge had consumed everything organic and left behind only the damaged skeleton of the ship itself. The bridge was my final stop. The navigation computers were destroyed,
Their screens cracked and darkened. The radio system had been reduced to a mass of melted components and severed wires, but the emergency beacon panel remained intact, its red activation switch gleaming under the emergency lighting.
I pressed the switch with trembling fingers, hearing the familiar electronic whine as the beacon began broadcasting our location and distress signal. The sound was reassuringly normal after everything I had experienced in the depths. Exhaustion hit me like a physical weight. The adrenaline that had kept me alert during the ascent drained away completely, leaving behind bone-deep fatigue and the realization that I hadn't eaten or drunk anything substantial in over a day. My legs gave out, and I collapsed beside the beacon panel, my body finally acknowledging the toll of surviving the impossible. Dehydration made my mouth feel like sandpaper. My lips were cracked, and swallowing had become painful. The safe room's emergency water supply had lasted longer than expected, but rationing the small containers over 26 hours had left me severely depleted. The ship's galley might have additional supplies, but I lacked the strength to search for them. I lay on the bridge floor, listening to the steady electronic pulse of the emergency beacon and the gentle rolling of the ship on surface waves. Real waves from the real ocean, not the alien environment we had discovered in the deep trench. I focused on these normal sounds, using them to anchor myself to the familiar world above the darkness. 6 hours passed before I heard the engines of an approaching vessel. The sound grew steadily louder until I could distinguish the specific thrumming of large military propellers cutting through the water. A U.S. Navy ship, judging by the engine signature and the coordinated efficiency of their approach. Voices carried across the water as they pulled alongside the Abyssal Clipper. Professional commands and status reports that indicated this was a trained rescue operation, not a chance encounter with a passing vessel. Someone had received our emergency beacon and dispatched proper resources to respond. The boarding party moved through the ship with practiced efficiency, their heavy boots echoing in the damaged corridors as they conducted their initial assessment. I heard them calling out room clearances and structural evaluations, the terminology of military personnel conducting a thorough search. "Survivor located on the bridge," a voice called out when they finally found me. 2 sailors in Navy uniforms lifted me carefully, supporting my weight as my dehydrated muscles struggled to function. They wrapped me in thermal blankets and carried me across to their ship, where a medical officer waited with IV fluids and emergency treatment supplies. The medical bay was clean and bright, everything functioning exactly as designed. Normal equipment operated by normal people following normal procedures. After the alien horror of the deep ocean, the routine efficiency of military medicine felt like stepping back into civilization. The medical officer, a serious woman with lieutenant's bars and gentle hands, started an IV drip and monitored my vital signs while asking careful questions about my condition. She treated the severe dehydration with practiced competence, adjusting the fluid flow as my body began accepting the desperately needed hydration. But her questions went beyond medical assessment. She wanted to know about the rest of the crew, about what had happened during our descent, about how I had survived when nobody else had. Her questions came with the careful precision of someone who had been briefed on more than just emergency medicine. There were 7 others aboard the ship, I told her as the IV fluids began clearing the fog from my thoughts. The captain, my research partner, the engineering crew, they're all dead. She exchanged a glance with the Navy officer who had been standing quietly by the medical bay entrance. That look carried weight and significance that went beyond concern for missing persons. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice neutral but attentive. I tried to explain about the black sludge, about how it had moved with intelligence and purpose, about watching it consume my colleagues one by one. The words sounded insane even as I spoke them, like the ramblings of someone who had been alone too long in a damaged vessel. "The substance came up from the ocean floor," I said, watching their faces for any sign of belief or understanding. "It wasn't just alive. It was hunting us. It dissolved metal, defied gravity, and it killed everyone who came into contact with it." The medical officer continued her work without comment, but I caught another meaningful glance between her and the Navy officer. Their expressions carried the polite skepticism of professionals dealing with someone whose grip on reality had been compromised by trauma. "Hallucinations are common in cases of severe oxygen deprivation and dehydration," the medical officer said gently. "Combined with the psychological trauma of losing your colleagues in what was obviously a catastrophic accident, your mind may have created explanations for events that were too overwhelming to process normally." "I'm not hallucinating," I insisted, though the doubt in their voices made me question my own memories. "The sludge was real. It killed them." The Navy officer stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. "We've examined your vessel, miss. There's evidence of a major hull breach and catastrophic system failure. Your colleagues probably died when the ship lost pressure integrity during descent. You survived because you managed to reach the emergency safe room before the worst of the damage occurred." Their version sounded reasonable, logical, based on evidence they could observe and measure. My story about intelligent black sludge sounded like the desperate fantasy of someone whose mind had snapped under pressure. Even I was beginning to wonder if the dehydration and isolation had distorted my memories of what really happened in the depths. They transported me to a military hospital in Hawaii, where I spent the next 3 days recovering under careful medical supervision. The hospital was modern and well-equipped, staffed by competent doctors who treated my physical condition with professional efficiency. But I noticed the guards posted outside my room, armed personnel who claimed to be there for my protection, but whose presence felt more like containment. My room had no phone access, no internet connection, no way to contact anyone outside the hospital. The doctors explained this as a precaution while I recovered from my ordeal, but the isolation felt deliberate. They were keeping me incommunicado while they decided what to do with my story. On my 3rd day in the hospital, after the doctors had declared me physically recovered and psychologically stable, a man in a black suit visited my room. He introduced himself as David Miller, representing a government agency I had never heard of, and carried a thick folder along with an expression that suggested our conversation would be anything but routine. He pulled a chair beside my bed and sat down with the patient manner of someone who had conducted similar interviews many times before. His presence filled the room with an authority that made the armed guards outside seem redundant. "Ms. Campbell," he said, opening his folder and revealing documents I couldn't read from my position. "We need to discuss what happened aboard the Abyssal Clipper." David Miller's presence changed everything about the sterile hospital room. His black suit looked expensive, tailored to fit someone who moved through government buildings and classified briefings as easily as breathing. The folder in his hands was thick enough to contain an entire life's worth of documentation, and something about the careful way he handled it suggested it probably did. I adjusted my position in the hospital bed, suddenly aware that my medical gown and IV line put me at a severe disadvantage in whatever conversation we were about to have. Miller's expression remained politely neutral, but his eyes carried the calculating intelligence of someone who had perfected the art of extracting information from reluctant subjects. "Before we begin," he said, opening the folder and withdrawing a thick document, "I need you to understand the legal framework that governs our discussion." He placed the papers on my bed with deliberate care, positioning them where I could read the header clearly. The document was titled, "Confidentiality Agreement, Classified Operations Division," in bold letters that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who saw them. Miller leaned back in his chair, allowing me time to scan the first page of dense legal text. The language was complex and intimidating, filled with references to national security protocols and criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. One section mentioned potential prosecution under the Espionage Act, while another outlined financial penalties that would bankrupt me for the rest of my life. The Abyssal Clipper mission was classified at a level far beyond your security clearance, Ms. Campbell, Miller explained as I struggled to process the legal terminology. Everything you experienced during that expedition is now a matter of national security, which means discussing it with unauthorized persons would constitute a federal crime. The casual way he delivered this information made it clear he had given similar speeches many times before. His tone suggested he was explaining simple facts rather than threatening my freedom. But the underlying message was unmistakable. The official record states that your vessel experienced catastrophic hull breach during descent to operational depth, he continued, pulling out additional documents from his folder. System failures led to progressive flooding that killed all crew members except yourself. You survived by reaching the emergency life support pod, where you remained until rescue operations located your vessel. Miller spoke as if he was reading from a prepared script, each word carefully chosen to create a complete narrative that explained away everything I had witnessed. His version was clean, logical, and completely false. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. "There was something down there, something that killed them." Miller nodded with the patient understanding of someone who had expected exactly this response. He reached into his folder again and withdrew a series of photographs, spreading them across my bed like playing cards. The images showed the Abyssal Clipper being towed by a massive military vessel toward what appeared to be a heavily fortified naval facility. Cranes and specialized equipment surrounded the damaged ship, while personnel in hazmat suits conducted careful examinations of the hull. The photographs captured every angle of the operation with professional precision. "Your vessel is currently being studied at a secure facility," Miller explained as I examined the images. "Teams of engineers and materials specialists are analyzing the damage patterns to determine exactly what caused the structural failures." He pointed to specific photographs that showed the ship's damaged sections, areas where the black sludge had eaten through metal plating and compromised the hull's integrity. But in these images, the damage looked like normal corrosion and metal fatigue, rather than the impossible destruction I had witnessed. "The families of your colleagues have already been notified," Miller added, his voice carrying a note of finality. "They've received the official explanation along with substantial compensation packages for their losses. The grieving process has begun based on the information they've been given." The weight of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Cheryl's family was mourning her death based on a lie. Matthew's relatives had been told he died in an industrial accident rather than the heroic sacrifice I had witnessed. All of them had been robbed of the truth about how their loved ones had actually died. I picked up the confidentiality agreement, reading through sections that outlined my obligations to maintain absolute silence about any classified aspects of the mission. The document was thorough and intimidating, clearly written by lawyers who specialized in national security cases. "I'm not signing this," I said, pushing the papers back toward Miller. "People have a right to know what's down there." Miller's expression didn't change, but he reached for his folder once more and withdrew a different set of documents. These pages contained detailed information about my personal life, credit reports, employment history, financial records, and background investigations that went back years. $47,000 in student loan debt, he read from the top page. currently unemployed with limited prospects in your field. Your sister Jennifer in Portland lost her job 6 months ago and is behind on rent. Your mother's medical expenses from her cancer treatment last year depleted most of the family's savings. He continued reading details that painted a complete picture of my financial vulnerability and family obligations. Information about Jennifer's unemployment benefits running out, about my mother's ongoing medication costs, about the precarious economic situation that had driven me to accept the mysterious expedition offer in the first place. We understand that financial pressure can lead people to make poor decisions, Miller said, closing the file and looking at me with what might have been sympathy. But we also understand that people generally want to protect their families from unnecessary hardship. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were crystal clear. Refusing to sign would bring consequences that extended far beyond my own career prospects. My family's financial stability depended on my cooperation with this cover-up. Miller retrieved a pen from his jacket and placed it beside the confidentiality agreement. The choice is yours, Ms. Campbell, but I should mention that the Department of Education has recently implemented new policies regarding student loan forgiveness for individuals who suffered trauma during government-related incidents. Even the inducements were disguised as threats. Sign the papers and receive financial relief. Refuse and watch my family suffer the consequences of my principles. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight like a chain around my wrist. Every signature I made would be another link in the restraints that would keep me silent for the rest of my life. But Jennifer's face appeared in my mind, along with my mother's worried expression when she talked about the medical bills that kept accumulating despite her insurance. The signatures took less than 2 minutes. My name appeared on page after page of legal documents that transferred my silence into the custody of whatever agency Miller represented. Each signature felt like a small death, a piece of truth being buried beneath layers of official lies and national security classifications. Miller collected the papers with practiced efficiency, storing them back in his folder alongside the photographs and background investigations. He stood up from his chair, straightening his suit jacket with movements that suggested our business was now concluded. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Campbell," he said, extending his hand for a formal handshake. "Someone will be in touch regarding your discharge procedures." 2 days later, I was back in my Seattle apartment, sitting on the same couch where I had first read the mysterious email that started everything. The journey from San Diego Harbor to this moment felt like traveling between different worlds. But the familiar surroundings couldn't erase the memories of what I had experienced in the depths. My laptop was exactly where I had left it, still displaying the desktop background photo of a coral reef I had photographed during graduate research. The image looked impossibly bright and cheerful after everything I had seen, a reminder of the ocean's beauty before I learned about the horrors it could hide. The email notification sound drew my attention to my inbox, where a message from Pacific Marine Research Institute waited among the usual spam and advertisements. The sender's address indicated it was from their Human Resources Department, but the subject line made my hands shake as I clicked to open it. Employment opportunity, senior marine biologist position. The email outlined a research position that exceeded every career goal I had imagined achieving at this stage of my life. Senior researcher status with a prestigious institute, access to state-of-the-art facilities, and a salary that would eliminate my student debt within 2 years. The benefits package included full medical coverage, retirement contributions, and research funding that would support any project I chose to pursue. The position came with one notable requirement. All research activities would be subject to government oversight and classification review. Any discoveries or publications would need approval from unspecified federal agencies before release to the scientific community. My laptop screen reflected my face as I stared at the offer, seeing the hollow expression of someone who had traded truth for comfort. The job was everything I had worked toward, handed to me as payment for my silence about the most important discovery in human history. Days turned into weeks as I tried to convince myself that accepting the position was the practical choice. Jennifer found new employment. My student loan forgiveness came through exactly as Miller had suggested, and my mother's medical expenses became manageable with my new insurance benefits. Everything in my life improved dramatically, except for the knowledge that ate at me like acid every time I closed my eyes. The black sludge haunted my thoughts constantly. During quiet moments at work, while reviewing harmless coral biology reports, my mind wandered back to the way that substance had moved with deliberate intelligence. I remembered how it had hunted through the ship's corridors, how it had consumed my colleagues without leaving any trace behind. Miller's photographs had shown the Abyssal Clipper being towed away for secret analysis. But what had happened to the samples Cheryl collected? Was that black mass still alive in some government laboratory, being studied by researchers who had no idea what they were dealing with? Or had it been returned to the ocean depths, left to grow and spread until something else disturbed its rest? The official story about hull breach and pressure failure appeared in several maritime safety publications, warning about the dangers of deep-sea exploration in uncharted waters. My colleagues were memorialized as victims of industrial accident, their real heroism buried beneath layers of classification and corporate liability protection. 3 months after returning to Seattle, I created an anonymous account on a deep web forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena and government cover-ups. The users were mostly conspiracy theorists and attention seekers, but it was the only place where I could tell the truth without violating my confidentiality agreement. I wrote everything: the mysterious expedition offer, the descent into the trench, the black sludge that defied physics and consumed my research team. Every detail poured out in a long post that read like science fiction to anyone who hadn't lived through it. The responses were exactly what I expected: skepticism, requests for proof, accusations that I was writing creative fiction for internet points. A few users claimed to have similar experiences with unexplained ocean phenomena, but their stories were so vague and poorly documented that they seemed more like attempts to gain attention than genuine encounters. Nobody believed me, which was probably exactly what Miller and his agency had counted on when they decided to let me keep my memories. The truth sounded so impossible that telling it only made me appear delusional, while the official story provided a reasonable explanation that satisfied everyone's need for logical conclusions. But I continued writing posts on that forum, adding details and analysis as they occurred to me. Somewhere in the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean, something ancient and malevolent was waiting in trenches that appeared on no official charts. It had killed 7 people with casual efficiency, and the only reason I survived was pure chance combined with Matthew's final sacrifice. The black sludge was still down there, patient and intelligent, resting in depths where no human expedition was supposed to venture. And despite all the classification agreements and government cover-ups, despite the comfortable job and financial security that kept me quiet, I knew that someday another research vessel would receive mysterious coordinates and an offer too generous to refuse. When that happened, I would be the only person alive who understood what they were sailing toward.